Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Will Beharrell, as Isabel says, and I'm the librarian here at the Linnean Society. And today we're going to be spending a little time with one of my favorite items in the Society's library, certainly one of its most famous, maybe even its most beautiful, and that is our copy of Edward Lear's illustrations of the family of the Psittacidae, better known as Lear's Parrots. Before we get started, I'll just explain, for those who haven't joined us before, that each of these Linnean Lens talks is usually split into three rough sections. And as Isabel says, the whole thing will generally last about 45 minutes to an hour. We'll start with a little introduction to the item and to its context with an inevitable PowerPoint presentation. And I promise I'll try and keep that bit relatively short, about sort of 10-15 minutes or so. And then we'll move on to the main event, an on-camera examination of Edward Lear's beautiful book. And lastly, if I've been disciplined and kept time, we should have an opportunity for some questions. And as Isabel says, please do feel free to post these into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window as we go along, and we'll come to those at the end. But before that, and before we turn to the book itself, we should maybe spend a little bit of time getting to know the man who made it. And I shall attempt to share my screen. Give me one moment. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation, Isabel? Marvelous. Yeah. All right. So, this is our hero. This is Edward Lear, drawn by the Dutch artist Wilhelm Maastrand in 1840, about 8 years or so after the publication, beg your pardon, of the Parrots. He was born on the 12th of May 1812 to Jeremiah and Anne Lear in Holloway in North London, and was the penultimate and youngest surviving addition to what was already a pretty sprawling family. Some suggest the Lears had as many as 21 children, but Edward was inconsistent on this detail later in life. And the family had a habit of recycling Christian names, not uncommon at a time of high infant mortality, and so the true number of Lears may well have been lower. In any case, it's fair to say the family suffered mixed financial fortunes throughout much of Lear's childhood. Jeremiah, Edward Lear's father, was a stockbroker at a time when the city of London was powerful, but also a chaotic and an uncertain place. In the economic turmoil that accompanied the seemingly endless wars with France at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, financial speculation was very much the order of the day, and vast fortunes were as easily lost as made. A widespread economic downturn followed the defeat of the French at Waterloo in 1815, and the following year, 1816, Jeremiah defaulted on his debts to the tune of over £2,000, which was a truly ruinous sum at the time. The Lears were temporarily forced from their gracious Regency villa for more modest accommodation in the city, and although the exile was only temporary, the threat of penury in the years ahead was never that far away. Jenny Uglow recounts in her wonderful biography of Lear that a recurrent image in his nonsense verse is of put upon father figures feeding endless lines of hungry offspring. In this cartoon, the old man of Apulia featured here, the whimsical gentleman is said to feed 20 sons upon nothing but buns, and the biographical parallels are almost too tempting to resist. In recounting Lear's life, it can be difficult to separate the truth from the mythology. Family stories of Jeremiah being served 6-course dinners in the King's Bench prison are surely fanciful, but the fact of financial instability seems to have been very real. Compounding the family's problems was the young Edward's fragile health, with chronic asthma and bronchitis leaving Lear often struggling for breath. And from the age of about 5, recurrent seizures brought on by a form of epilepsy. This was a time when epilepsy was still considered a source of shame for the individual, a mark of impurity or weakness of character. Lear doesn't seem to have experienced the sort of grand mal fits that are maybe familiar to us from television dramas, but he does seem to have experienced a more insidious set of disturbances affecting not just movement, but also speech, memory, emotional regulation, and the senses. The condition waxed and waned throughout Lear's life and was a source of constant anxiety, fear, and shame. It may also explain in part the strained relationship with his parents, his father absent and his mother, to all intents and purposes, cold and distant. Uglo notes that in Lear's diary, when recording his mother's birthday, the word mother appears in eloquent quotation marks, to borrow Uglo's phrase. At around the age of about 4 or 5, Edward was effectively handed over to the care of his eldest sister, also called Anne, who became his de facto mother and stood really in loco parentis right up until her death in 1861, when Lear was just about to turn 50. This was probably the most profound relationship in Lear's life, and it may be from Anne that Lear received his first true introductions to literature and to the fine arts. The word prodigy is possibly overused in discussions of young talent, but I think if anyone fits the definition, it would be Edward Lear. From the age of about 14 or 15, Lear was already undertaking paid work as a scientific illustrator for publication, and in either 1829 or 1830, he received his first major commission, 14 plates of birds and mammals to illustrate the zoology of Captain Beechey's voyage, and a sample plate by Lear from that publication is on the screen. I think the teenage Lear's talent is already obvious here in this detailed and quite charming study, and an augury of much greater works to come. It's also around this time, in the late 1820s, 1830s, that Lear meets his first great early patron, a man called Edward Smith Stanley, better known as the Earl of Derby. And here he is in a contemporary etching. Stanley was a powerful figure in early 19th century science, being simultaneously a wealthy landowner, a well-connected peer of the realm, and a polymath collector of art, antiquities, and natural history. In the early 1830s, he was president of both the Linnean and the Zoological Societies, and would have been an invaluable friend and ally to an aspiring ornithological artist. Urban legend has it that Stanley first encountered the then teenage Lear sketching birds in the grounds of the newly inaugurated Zoological Society premises in Regent's Park, better now known, of course, as London Zoo, and even ushered him into the cages to get a closer look at the birds. And this is Lear's impression of how that encounter might have gone. The story is possibly apocryphal, not least because Stanley's own menagerie was actually at Knowsley Hall near Liverpool rather than the zoo. But Stanley and the Zoological Society were both certainly valued patrons of Lear's for much of the 1830s, and it's true that one of Lear's innovations was his preference for drawing birds from life rather than from, say, skins or from taxidermy. So again, there may be a grain of truth behind the fanciful tale. We could spend a great deal longer delving into the details of Lear's life, and we'll come back to his biography briefly at the end of the talk. But I think with time pressing on, we should maybe get to the main event and examine the book itself. So we shall do exactly that. And I'm very pleased to have Isabelle Chamontier here to act as my assistant. If we could move the spotlight from me to the book. Can everybody see Lear's parrots on a book cushion?
Yeah, all
Very
good.
good. Excellent. So this is it. This is Lear's Parrots, self-published by the artist in 1832. And probably the first thing that strikes you about it is its size. It's a very substantial folio volume, over 57 centimeters in height, 39 in width. It's about 22 inches by 15 in old money. It's not the largest book of the 19th century. That distinction probably goes to John James Audubon's pretty outrageous 1827 Birds of America, which is nearly a meter in height and has probably ruined the back of more than one librarian over the years. Lear actually met Audubon in the 1820s and may well have been inspired by the use of a large format when contemplating his own project. And compared to many ornithological works that preceded it, even those with illustrations, this large size is a significant departure. And we can actually have a look at a quick look at a bird book from an earlier time, just briefly. This is a book from our library called Ornithologiae Libri Tres, produced by John Ray and Francis Willoughby in 1676. And you can see that although it's still, fairly hefty in a folio format, it's quite significantly smaller in size than the Parrots, about 10 inches smaller, in fact. And the benefits of the larger format are obvious. They allow for a much greater richness of illustrative detail, as well as enabling the artist to depict the subjects a little bit closer to life size. And if we turn to an illustrated plate, Isabel, you can see that although still very beautiful, the quality of the illustration here in the 17th century is, I would say, still considerably cruder than Lear's results in the 19th. I feel sorry to say goodbye to Willoughby, but let's go back to the Parrots if we can, and we'll just settle on the title page. Bookmark 1, there we are. So another innovation of Lear's was the decision to focus his efforts on a single bird family. Lear's rather unwieldy title, as you can see here, may not seem very striking to us, but it represented a further departure from established practice. You may remember that Willoughby's volume was simply entitled Ornithology, a general treatment of birds, and this approach was commonplace for much of the 18th, 17th and 18th centuries. Where authors did seek to limit the scope of their works, they often did so geographically. For example, Edward Donovan's 1797 History of British Birds, or they might do it conceptually, as in George Edwards' History of Uncommon Birds. But defining his terms of reference taxonomically in this way was, if not exactly pioneering, then certainly unusual for the time. Could we turn to the Yellow Macaw, please, Isabel? What really sets Lear's work apart, of course, is the, I would say, unsurpassed quality of the illustration, even in the absence of a great deal of explanatory text. When we think back to Willoughby's engraved plates in the 17th century, I would argue the improvement is really pronounced. Part of the reason for this, I think, is Lear's use of a technology that wasn't available to Willoughby 150 or so years earlier, namely a printing technique known as lithography. Lithographic printing was invented in Germany in 1796 and uses a simple chemical process to create a very detailed image. And I think it might be worth explaining in brief just how lithography works, because it's an unusual technique, quite different from other sorts of printing we might commonly encounter here in the hand press period before about 1850. In a lithograph, firstly, an artist copies the desired image onto a big slab of limestone with a special waxy stylus or crayon. And then the slab is treated with a solution of nitric acid and gum arabic. And this eats away at the parts of the limestone not protected by the wax. The etched surface is then wetted and oil-based ink is applied, and the ink is held only by the greasy crayon lines, and copies can then be printed directly from the stone. A monochrome print, a mirror image of the original drawing, can then be skillfully coloured by hand, and in Lear's case, lustrously enhanced with egg white to give an added sheen to the bird's plumage and also the eyes. Could we turn to the red and yellow macaw? Might actually be the blue and yellow macaw. Yes, it is. I think this is my favourite plate in the book for my money. As a technique, lithography has several benefits. Perhaps most importantly for Lear, it allows the artist to work directly with the plate to be printed. That is to say, Lear was able to paint an image directly onto the stone, which could then be used to take a printed impression. This differs significantly from most forms of intaglio printing, where the business of engraving the printing plate was usually done by a specialist engraver, not the original artist. This not only increases the possibility for errors and loss of fidelity to the artist's original, but also can massively increase the costs of production, as such skilled engraver craftsmen commanded high wages at this time. And as we know, Lear was not privately wealthy, and even with powerful patrons, there would have been a pressure to control costs. Another benefit of lithography is that many art critics maintain that lithographs have a more direct and lively feel than comparable woodblock or copperplate engravings. I think there's room for personal preference here. You know, many woodblock and copper plates are stunning, but I think it's undeniable that Lear's parrot images are wonderfully vivid and characterful, and this may well be attributed to his decision to draw his subjects both from life, wherever possible, but also rendered directly via lithography. And perhaps at this point we might just start to sort of meander through our book and turn the pages. The achievement is doubly impressive when you appreciate that Lear's proficiency in lithography came at an amazingly young age. He began the project when he was barely 18 and was largely self-taught. He certainly benefited from the mentorship of his printer, a man named Charles Joseph Holmandel, from whom he rented equipment and who was probably the leading lithographer of the age. But surviving evidence from Lear's sketchbooks and early proofs show Lear independently experimenting with the technique and rapidly growing in confidence. So, how was the book received, and what became of the man who created it? Well, it would be lovely to say that the book was a roaring success and Lear never had to work again. But the reality is the illustrations of the Psittacidae was, at least financially, I think it's fair to say, a failure. Lear struggled with the costs of producing the work, even going so far as to erase and reuse lithographic blocks once a certain number of copies had been printed. In common with many scientific publications at the time, the sales model he adopted was advance subscription. This was a sort of proto Kickstarter, I suppose, where interested parties paid for the product in advance, thus financing its production, and then received the goods later, either as a finished volume or, in Lear's case, in installments. Despite enthusiastic backing from Lord Stanley and others, Lear really struggled to attract sufficient subscribers and only sold 125 copies. Among the first institutional subscribers, I'm very pleased to say, was the Linnean Society, almost certainly at Stanley's insistence. And the copy in front of you today almost certainly came to our library by benefit of that original subscription. As a little aside, in his really excellent history of Lear's Parrots, Bob Peck suggests that not all the subscribers actually paid for the book that they had bought. So I looked for this subscription in the gift books and the accounts of the Linnean Society and was unable to find it. So I can only hope that we made good on our debt in the in the 1830s. In any case, despite scrabbling for funds, Lear swiftly ran out of money, and the project as you see it today is in fact unfinished. Further instalments were indefinitely postponed due to lack of funds. And with mounting debts, Lear was forced, rather forlornly, to sell his remaining copies to John Gould, that other great British bird artist, for £50 in March 1833. But if the Parrots were a financial failure, reputationally, they were a sterling success. The quality of the images certainly established Lear as a leading ornithological illustrator and secured him further scientific work with Gould. He's even reputed to have been employed by Queen Victoria as an art teacher, although as far as I can make out, these lessons took place quite some time later, in 1846, and it would appear she was more impressed by Lear's landscape watercolours of Italy than by his bird paintings. Lear moves away from scientific illustration later in life. The reasons for this are a little uncertain, but the experience of producing the Parrots was financially bruising for Lear, and later moves towards landscape art, and of course, popular verse, were probably more lucrative. It's also true that Lear's eyesight deteriorated throughout his life, and it's possible that as his vision suffered, he was less able to achieve the sort of fine detail required for lithographic work. Sadly, there isn't a time in this short talk to recount Lear's many subsequent adventures. He led a long, eventful, if not altogether happy life, and died in San Remo, Italy in 1888, aged 75. If you'd like to learn more about Lear's later life, I can thoroughly recommend Jenny Uglow's biography, Mr. Lear, A Life of Art and Nonsense. And for more information on Lear's natural history and interests, I think a very good place to start is Bob Peck's Natural History of Edward Lear. But in the meantime, it's been a real privilege to share one of my favourite items with you today. Thank you so much for listening to me. I think I've just about kept to time semi-miraculously. So we should have plenty of time for questions. And I'm very happy to take those now.
Thank you very much, Will, for a quick overview of this wonderful book. Actually, I have to say, we have so many treasures, and it's lovely to work with them, but we rarely have the time to really look at them. And just flipping through those pages with the light shining on it, it's absolutely wonderful. So we do have, I'm just going to change my glasses. We do have a little bit of time for questions, and there are a few that have come in. So I'll start with the top one from Cheryl Lynn. Are all of these parrots, are these all of the parrots that we have in the world? What's the most unique parrot that we rarely see that is printed in the book? I should say, I don't know what the other inquiries are going to be like, but neither Will nor I are ornithologists, so bear with us. We won't be able to answer the more ornithological minded queries. If there are any ornithologists in the audience, please feel free to put any replies that you think might be appropriate, either in the Q&A or in the chat. Will?
Yes, and I meant to say, if there are any ornithologists on the call and feel like chipping in with superior knowledge to ours, please do feel free. No, they're not all the parrot species that we have in the world, not least of all because the project was unfinished. I think it was originally intended to run to 14 parts and only 12 were produced. So that suggests straight off the bat that some species were omitted. Truthfully, not being an ornithologist, I don't know how many parrot species there are in the world, but there are certainly more than 42. In terms of rarity, I'm not sure either. If I had more time in the researching of this talk, I might have cross-referenced species names against things like the IUCN Red List and see whether there are any endangered species among Lear's subjects. But my time was limited, so I'm afraid that's not a question I can answer.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry, I just see Martin Nicol. Hello again,
Yes.
Martin. Says 175 Psittacidae in the world. So there you are. You did pretty well. 42 out of 175 isn't bad.
So there's a few questions that are on the same subjects, I think, which is where did he find his models? Where did he observe them?
Well, certainly one of his great innovations was a preference for drawing from life, and certainly he made use of the zoological gardens in Regent's Park. This was at a time when the ZSL, so far as I understand, was not a public zoo in the sense that we know it today. It was really a private facility for the use of ZSL fellows. And so Lear was, you know, at a very young age granted quite exceptional access to the collections there. And I think most of the subjects he depicts in the parrots were painted at ZSL. But as I say, his great benefactor's own menagerie, that is Lord Derby's, was at Knowsley, which is a country estate near Liverpool. So it's not impossible that he might also have seen birds there. I do understand that he also did paint from skins and taxidermies, but I think as a matter of last resort, if no living bird could be found, then he would do that.
And actually, speaking of Knowsley, someone asks, are the descendants of these parrots that Lear came across and drew now at Knowsley Safari Park?
As in the ancestor, the descendants of these parrots?
Yes.
I've no idea. Gosh, possibly.
So there's a few before. Actually, there is a question that we had kind of anticipated about white gloves. Shall we? Do you want
yeah,
to give
sure. We have a running
that?
bet on the collection staff about whether we might be asked about white gloves, because it is a very common misconception that rare books need to be handled with white gloves. In fact, best practice these days for handling rare books and other special collections items is generally thought to be clean, dry hands. And that's simply because you lose so much dexterity when you're wearing a set of gloves that you actually are in danger of causing greater damage to the book than just with your bare hands. And I blame television for this.
Yeah,
this is a TV affectation. If you see an auction or an antique show on TV and someone's wearing white gloves, it's a TV trope, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now we've got that out of the way. There are quite a few, sorry, there are about 22 questions in there, so I'm parsing through them. There are quite a few on the process of illustration. Sorry, I've lost them now. One of them was, yes, was each copy individually colored by hand? And would he have worked on his own? Would he have done it, or would hand colorists done it? And how many? Was it a team?
Yes, they were colored by hand, and that added to their value and to the expense of production. From what I've read, Lear employed professional colorists for the bulk of the Psittacidae subscriber set, and I believe he used predominantly young women. I think that was a profession in which women were commonly employed. I understand from our curator of artifacts, Glenn Benson, who I think might be on the call, that Lear did personally colour some early proofs of the Psittacidae plates, and that these are now preserved in the collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum. I don't know if they're catalogued or publicly findable, but I'll have to dispatch Glenn to go look at them. So he certainly coloured some, but the majority, I think, were done by craftspeople.
Can I add to that that Bob Peck actually says, thank you for a wonderful talk. You might want to mention that most of the original watercolors survive. Some are at the Houghton, I think.
Houghton, I
yeah,
think, yes.
At Harvard, and others are in Knowsley Hall, actually, in Lord Derby's library near Liverpool.
Yes, and I drew upon the resources at the Houghton in preparing this talk, and I should give them a proper hat tip, really. That is probably the largest archival collection devoted to Lear, although there is still material in Liverpool and also at the National Archives. It's quite a dispersed archival footprint, if you like.
There's a question about the binding, saying the binding looks contemporary. Did the Linsock bind the images?
It is. I can show you the binding. This is a little success story, I think. When I first came to the Linnean Society about 5 years ago, the Parrots were in a pretty poor state, I think it's fair to say. They were in a fairly unsympathetic 1920s, 1930s buckram binding and falling apart. And so we had them conserved under the auspices of our book sponsorship scheme called Adopt Lin. And Isabel might be able to pop a link to that scheme in the chat. And funnily enough, the person who sponsored it was Glenn Benson, our curator of artifacts. He's clearly a big fan of Lear's Parrots. And he gave the money for it to be really beautifully rebound in these marbled paper covers and a quarter leather binding. It's a shame in a way that the contemporary 1830s binding wasn't preserved. I wonder if it might have betrayed evidence of its status as a subscription copy, and also as a book that was delivered in parts. It might have included publishers' wrappers, part papers, but sadly that was lost certainly by the time I started, probably long before that, and it's now been rebound, mostly to preserve it for use. It's now a book that's actually pretty robust. I'm very happy for people to come and look through it with supervision. It will outlast me, certainly.
I'm going to keep on. I know there's quite a few questions, but just to keep on with the illustrations and the images, there's a question about the use of egg white to create a sheen, and where would that person go for more information on this technique? Was it widespread in the use of watercolor at the time?
Yes, so far as I know, egg white has been used to bring out the luster in colors for centuries. I think you can detect the use of eggs and egg white going right back to the medieval period. I don't know, not being a painter myself, exactly how it is done, but I feel sure that you would be able to find resources available online. I find YouTube incredibly instructive on this sort of thing. When I was trying to get my head around how lithography worked, I was sort of squinting at these bibliographical manuals from the 1950s that sort of try and explain it. And actually a 2-minute video on YouTube, and I could grasp it straight away. So yeah, see what's out there.
Yes, because there is someone else asking to know a little bit more about the process of lithography. So I feel you've just conveniently answered that. Thank you. There are a couple of questions about potentially, did Lear intend to do another Parrot book or more illustrations?
He certainly intended to make more illustrations. The Parrots was intended to be bigger than it is. I think I'm right in saying he intended it to be issued in 14 parts, of which 12 were eventually produced. My understanding is he simply ran out of money. The project didn't attract sufficient interest. I wonder if in part it was because it does lack supporting scholarly text. they come with species IDs, and they are depicted life size, and where they're not depicted life size, they include a scale. So they have scientific value for sure, but it's not like it's not a book like Willoughby's. There's not a great deal of accompanying sort of discoursing on the subject of parrots. It's a slighter work in that sense. But yes, they were definitely, it was intended to be bigger.
Sorry. Yes, there are a couple of questions or comments related to the Naturalist Library. Someone says, you didn't mention Lear's are the other parrot illustrations for the Naturalist Library. However, hang on, because someone else answered that later on. And yes, there is an answer. As far as I'm aware, the plates in the Naturalist Library are copies after Lear, not made by Lear himself. I don't know if you know anything about that, Will.
Not off the top of my head. I know that Lear yes, he scrabbled for money, I think it's fair to say, throughout the 1830s, and worked as a jobbing, if that's the right word, scientific illustrator for various people, including John Gould. The timeline can be a little confused. If you think about the zoology of Captain Beechey's voyage, that work was done in the 1820s, 1830s, but not published until 1839 because of huge delays to the production process from one of the authors. And so it can be difficult to sort of pinpoint exactly when a Lear drawing might have been done sometimes, and that can complicate the business of his timeline, I suppose.
There's a few questions about his networks and influences. So David Horwell asks, did Audubon plagiarize any of Lear's illustrations?
It might have been in character. I don't know, is the truth. Audubon's a pretty shifty individual by my estimation. No offense to any Audubon fans on the call, but it's certainly true that he was not averse to plagiarizing the work of his contemporaries and stealing specimens and that sort of thing. I don't know if he stole from Lear, is the truth.
And there's another question. I don't know if I wouldn't know the answer to this. So as he worked with John Gould, do we know whether Lear ever met with Darwin?
That's a really good question. I don't. I wonder if anyone on the call does. Not to my knowledge. It's not beyond the bounds. They were both members of the Linnean Society. One of the other reputational benefits of the Parrots publication was that Lear was made an associate member of the Linnean Society. So it's possible that they crossed paths, but I wouldn't want to say for certain.
So there are a few questions about Lears Maau. Given that Edward Lear gave his name to Lear's, well, anyway, I'll read out the few that are related to that. So someone says it's now endangered and bred in Cornwall, and if you join the World Parrot Trust, you'll get to know all about it. But there is, yes, Tony Pittman asked, what about it? Because you did not show an illustration of it. But then Ray Heaton indicates that Lears Macaw is now very rare, only discovered because he put the size on the plate. His plate, it looks like a hyacinth macaw otherwise. I think this is beyond our expertise, possibly.
It is. I'm so sorry, gentlemen. This is not something I feel qualified to speak about. Do we have the plate? Can anyone tell us the reference off the top of their head?
I thought we showed the hyacinth macaw, I thought. But if someone knows otherwise, then I will.
Bob Peck says there's no evidence that Lear ever met with Darwin, so I'm glad I didn't go in too hard on that question.
Okay, Graham Avery, if I can find, yes, hello, Graham. What other materials related to Lear does the Society have? And he's also asking, I don't know if we'll know this, do copies of the Parrot's book sometimes come on the market, and at what price?
They do. I should maybe be a little circumspect here
Yes, I
for
think you
security
should.
reasons. Let's just say if you go onto Google, you can go onto Christie's website and find out what prices they have fetched over the years. They don't come onto the market very often. Many of them are now in institutional settings, as of course is this one. But they do emerge infrequently in various degrees of condition and completeness. We're very pleased with this one. There was a rumor in the society for a long time that our copy was somehow special and that it was sort of
I think it is. I think it has one more plate than most.
well, we looked into this. Well, I looked into this for the talk, and I'm afraid it's not true. Ours is it's a very fine copy and it's in good condition, but it has exactly the same number of plates as any of the others. The only thing it does possess is that it has a lot of the front matter, so the subscribers list and the dedication to the to the Queen and all the rest of it. Sometimes that stuff is missing in other copies, but no one's buying the Parrots for the subscribers list, so. In terms of the plates, we've got a good set.
Thank you. I'm trying to still parse through. Romita Ray, hello Romita, says Lear famously made multiple preliminary drawings for his spectacular landscape paintings, and she asks whether any preliminary drawings survive for the parent prints, but I think we've answered that earlier.
Yeah, early pulls of the lithography survive at the V&A, I think, and then the watercolors, from what I was able to ascertain and from what Bob Peck suggests, might be at the Houghton in Harvard.
There's an interesting question. Do we know who taught him to draw like this as a 14-year-old?
From what I understand, his sister, eldest sister Anne, was a major influence, certainly in terms of introducing him to his literary interests. She was a great reader, and I understand Lear picked up that interest from her. I'm not sure. Very good question.
Sorry.
Lots of people saying that the Darwin Correspondence Project and others record no correspondence between Lear and Darwin. So it seems unlikely that they met.
Okay, I think we have gone round. I feel the questions that we can answer. I mean, there is a question about bibliography, about whether you would recommend any books about scientific illustrators of the 19th century. The top of your head.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, for Edward Lear, and I'm sorry, Bob, your cheeks must be burning getting name checked so many times, but the natural history of Edward Lear, I would say, is the best place to start for Lear's natural history interests. In terms of scientific illustration, it tends to diverge in terms of botanical art and zoological art. So I suppose Stern's book is still probably the Bible for botanical illustration. The full title of it escapes me, but you could find it on Google fairly easily. And I'm not so sure for zoological illustration, but email me afterwards and I will endeavour to pull together some references.
There was a question about the subscribers list and whether it includes any interesting names.
Oh, well, we can have a look.
We can have a look, yes.
Could we move the spotlight back to the book, maybe? So we have the Great and the Good. Prideaux John Selby is a name that might be familiar to some people. He was an ornithologist, I think. Thomas Bell, he was a president of the Linnean Society. He famously said in 1859 that no great advances had taken place in biology that year, and that, of course, was the year that Origin of Species was published. So red faces all around there. The Stanleys. Lots of institutional subscribers. So the Literary and Philosophical Society of Newcastle. Over here, we've got the Linnean Society. Interestingly, at our old address, we were still in Soho Square back in the 1830s, and the Zoological Society beneath us at Bruton Street. Hullmundell, that was Lear's printer, who he rented lithographical equipment from, the Stones. More aristocrats. William Swainson, another famous natural historian, fellow of the Linnean Society. G.T. Fox and Dilwyn, likewise. It's curious to know which of these people defaulted on their subscriptions. Lear complains, I think it's in his letters, that not everybody who said that they would buy a copy ended up paying for the one they received. I think that was quite a source of anxiety for him during the course of the project.
Okay, thank you very much, Will. I should add, if you, so our copy hasn't not been digitized, but I just had a look on Biodiversity Heritage Library, and it is, Lears Parrots is available on Biodiversity Heritage Library, so you can have a look at it online if you wish. Apologies if we haven't got to everyone's questions. I just wanted to finish with a spotlight on our own treasures book called L50, which figures 50 treasures of the Linnean Society, and it has a section on Lear's parrots. There it is. If it's costs £12 and it's available from our website. And it remains me to thank Will for a very engaging talk. Thank you very much, Will. Our next Linnean Lens, and I should have prepared this before, I think will be in March, and it's going to be on the Rudbeck blocks presented by Roger Gaskell. So join us then. Everything, all our events are all. I'll start again. All our events are on our website, and there is much more available online and in person. So do check out our website for our rich event list. Thank you very much, Will, and see you all very soon. Bye.